Hello.
Our story begins inside the home of Anakin and Shmi Skywalker. The Boonta Eve was won. Anakin was no longer a slave, and his Podracer was sold. Everything seemed to be in optimal condition. As Anakin and Qui Gon returned, he informed the two of them that the boy was no longer a slave. This news was both surprising to mother and son. They were still very confused, and it was semi-explained. Qui Gon expressed that they could return to Coruscant with Anakin and he could train to become a Jedi. Anakin was overjoyed at first, and then like a chill passing through his body, he realized that Qui Gon only freed one of them. Anakin asked about his mother, and the Jedi Master expressed that Watto only allowed for Anakin to be freed. Sadly, Shmi was to remain a slave, which also meant she would stay here on Tatooine. Initially, Anakin thought about the prospect of going off to become a Jedi. He'd been having dreams about it a lot as of late. He was excited about the idea of using a Jedi weapon and learning the Force. But now that his mother was getting screwed over, he didn't really think he could do that. Anakin went to his mother and asked her what he should do. Shmi couldn't hold Anakin back. Did she want to be alone? Of course not, but she wanted what was best for her son. The fact that he wasn't a slave was good enough, but going to the center of the galaxy and staying inside a safe Jedi temple sounded like a much better deal in her mind. There was no reason to waste his life away inside this scum-ridden city. Anakin could see in her eyes the fear of losing him. Not that she was going to hold him back, but Shmi wanted only what was best for Anakin. She told him that they couldn't control fate, just like how they couldn't stop the suns from setting. If this was his destiny, and if it was what his heart truly desired, then he should go, and never look back. Anakin looked at Qui Gon, who optimistically looked over him. He truly believed that Anakin was the chosen one. There was no other way around it. The Jedi Master waited patiently for Anakin to make his decision, and then it wasn't the one he was hoping for. Anakin turned back. The thought of his mother being abandoned here made him angry. He looked at Qui Gon and tried to gracefully get his way through this, but he couldn't. He told the Jedi Master that it was a terrible mistake helping them out. Why would a Jedi just take one of them if the other had to remain a slave? Anakin looked back to his mother and then he turned to face Qui Gon. If the Jedi were meant to be guardians of peace and justice, then why no justice? Anakin could selfishly, admittedly, see why Qui Gon couldn't free all the slaves on the planet. But the fact that he would so selfishly take a boy away from his enslaved mother was the most ironic testament to what the Jedi had become. Qui Gon could kill Watto if he wanted. He had the power to do that much. And then from there he could take both of them back to Coruscant and they could live a happy life while Anakin studied to become a Jedi. Qui Gon tried to slow down the conversation, promising that he would come back with more Jedi. It was in this moment that Anakin saw what the Order was and what it did to people. Qui Gon would never come back. It was a false promise. If he had any care in the galaxy for the slaves, then he would stay here and he would work to free them. Anakin knew by this point that there was another Jedi on planet. That Jedi could go back to Coruscant and complete the mission with the Queen or something. Anakin told Qui Gon that he should just leave before he did any other damage. He tried to reason with Anakin, but there was no chance. The little boy pointed at the door as he marched over and pushed Qui Gon out of it and locked it behind him. As Anakin turned around, he fell to the ground and tears fled from his eyes. Shmi was by his side the second the door closed. She told him that there was no shame in leaving her here. This was her place. He could go and see the vast galaxy, that's what he wanted. Qui Gon put his hand against the door and listened in, using the Force to silence his mind and take in the conversation happening on the other side of the door. Anakin said that he truthfully thought about becoming a Jedi, and how that'd be cool, but if he was being honest, it didn't matter anymore. Even if his mother believed that he should go to Coruscant, he didn't want to anymore. The prospect of the Jedi Order was ruined for him. In his dreams, the Jedi were peacekeepers, selfless, individuals that did the right thing, and now it only felt like the Jedi used them. Now, as he saw this perspective, a Jedi Master came to this planet, enlisted an enslaved child, agreed to allow that child to race in the most deadly sport in the galaxy, win them a prize while granting him his freedoms and expecting said boy to give up his entire home for winning them a prize. That didn't sound like a fair trade in Anakin's mind. It was cruel and unreasonable, and sure, the whole freedom from slavery thing was cool, but there was the inverse viewing of this feeling. If they really thought about it, which Anakin was doing at the moment, Qui Gon only freed Anakin so he could gain something from him. How convoluted was that? If Anakin wasn't the chosen one or whatever Qui Gon believed he was, then why would he place his bet on him to free him? Everything Qui Gon told Anakin was a lie, and Anakin spit out the words, telling his mother that he hated the Jedi. He never wanted to see their stench again. She patted his shoulder and told him, with sorrow in her eyes, that they likely never would. The Jedi would go back to Coruscant and forget all about them, because they never cared about people in the Outer Rim. They gave up, just like the Republic. She assured him though, reminding him that with his family and his friends, they would have strength together. They didn't need the Corps, or the Jedi, or the Republic to make it by, because they always got by without them. Anakin grabbed his mom's hand and promised her that he would free her from slavery. He understood that there wasn't anything he or she could do about it in the moment, but he promised her that he'd free her. As they got up and she prepared to make Anakin his favorite meal, he launched a bowl at the wall. Qui Gon was still on the other side of the door listening in. Anakin spun around, his eyes were covered in redness and his voice cracked as he told his mom that Qui Gon Jinn made them sell his pod racer. He couldn't even go back to racing. She told him that it was okay. He should focus on being an actual kid for once. He was no longer a slave, and that was a much better life than the one he had before the Boonta Eve. He could take those skills and apply them to a mechanic shop, or teaching other racers how to win, or even qualify for the Boonta Eve Classic. Anakin nodded his head, but he was sad. He spent so much time building that racer, it would be nearly impossible to get another one built like that. As Qui-Gon was leaving the residence, he questioned everything. Maybe Anakin was right. Perhaps Dooku was right about what their order meant to the people of the galaxy. He didn't even consider how jarring this must have been for young Skywalker. He was a child slave, freed, and then about to go across the entire galaxy without his mother. Qui-Gon thought about killing Watto, but that was not the Jedi way. As a practitioner of the light, it would be improper for him to do that. He would lose his path and it would make him more like Dooku than he wanted to be. With Qui-Gon returning to the ship empty-handed, Anakin and Shmi had themselves some food and ate through it. The lucky part was the credits they acquired from Anakin's racer. The unlucky part was the fact that they didn't have said racer, so Anakin would have to start from scratch. But luckily, his mother was going to give him the support he needed. Shmi, while still being in total disagreement with the pod racing lifestyle, told her son that it could be rebuilt, this time better. There was no reason for him to get up in his head about these type of things. She reminded him how the change was necessary. His next pod racer could be the best one ever created. He asked her if she really thought so, and she nodded her head, gently knocking his head and reminding him that he won the Boonta Eve Classic on his first try. He could do anything, as long as he stayed dedicated to it. In the following days, Anakin was settled into his life as a free boy. He was able to spend more time with his best friends Kitster and Wald, which was very nice for him. Anakin also had to spend a lot of time avoiding the local gangs of the planet. One of the local gangs was called Dragon's Wrath. It was a local group, something about a crate dragon, and that's how they got their name or something. The man who ran the gang, or crew as he liked to call it, was a local boy named Jalem Lihil. He was a little rough around the edges, and he always tried to convince Anakin to join his gang. It wasn't that Anakin would join the gang for the sake of gang wars, but more so for the fact that they needed able bodies for the crew. Skywalker had no interest. Jalem would continue bothering Anakin for a couple more weeks until he eventually gave up. Due to the local respect between gangs and crews, those recruiting would typically pester people for a week or two and then leave them alone. Ironically, Jalem didn't want Anakin for muscle, he wanted him as a mechanic. Would have paid him nice too, but Anakin wasn't really trying to be a mechanic for Dragon's Wrath. The crews of the city had grudge matches with each other, and it wasn't long after Boonta Eve where skirmishes and turf wars would begin again. It was a whole thing, but the main reason behind it was Jabba. He gave these gangs their territory and presided over them. They always felt like if they could have control over their territory, they could control their lives. It was manufactured control, and Jabba had a grip over their hope. So he manipulated them into fighting with each other instead of him. These gang wars after Boonta Eve were a result of gangs taking bets with each other, or shops in the town, and then forcing people to pay up. Skywalker wanted no part in being their mechanic, not because of the pay, or even because of Jalem. It was actually because of the fact that he would be labeled as a member of that crew, not by Dragon's Breath, but by scouts and spies of the other local gangs. This meant that Anakin would be seen as a target, and that really wasn't something he wanted. Because he was no longer a slave, Anakin spent a lot of time roaming around the city. He had a tray that he would carry parts on. Of course, it just meant he'd have to clean the parts even more when he got back to his home. But he was 9, it was pretty difficult for him to carry these large pieces of metal around, especially in the sun. Skywalker would spend weeks upon weeks gathering free supplies and bartering for gears, cables, energy binders, fuel systems, engine compartments, metallic shells, and so forth. The issue was, as if building an entire pod racer from the age of 9 wasn't hard enough again, he had to retrace all of his steps. Though all the extra time he had was a gift. He could work on 3PO some more, and it was actually 3PO that he paid to get his shell for. The protocol droid was probably his best friend at the moment. Anakin felt like he had a chip on his shoulder. which forced him to become obsessed with building this new pod racer and showing himself, his friends, the sponsors, and his mother that he was the best. He wanted to be the best, and he wanted to free his mom. That was the goal he had most. She was his biggest supporter, and she always took care of him. Even if the days were hard, stressful, tiring, or never ending, she always made the time of day for him and supported him. Before the Boonta Eve, she would always be with him when he started the engine. If it mattered to him, it mattered to her. So even if it was as simple as just practice session with a pod racer, it was important to be there in her mind. Maybe she disagreed with the whole pod racing dream, but it wasn't her dream. If Anakin wanted it, then she'd be by his side all the way through. These habits remained very similar in the days, weeks, and months that followed. Anakin constructed a new pod racer for himself, and he prepared for a chance to race again in the Boonta Eve Classic. Due to the fact that Anakin won the previous year, he was able to gain a sponsor that got him a placement inside the starting lineup. However, there was of course the trouble that remained for him. He'd be racing against his former pod racer, and the pilot of said racer was a rival from the previous Boonta Eve. The champion, prior to Anakin's win, Saboba was on his revenge tour. While Anakin was building a brand new racer, Saboba was winning back-to-back races across the galaxy. His previous loss was embarrassing, but he had no intention to ever lose again. Individuals at the Boonta Eve were excited to see Anakin race again. Despite his victory in the previous race, many fans feared that they wouldn't be able to see Anakin's career take off. Now that he was here, it was clear the only reason he missed the previous races was because he was just a kid. Regardless, it hurt Anakin to see his legendary pod racer slathered in orange. Saboba, after buying it off a young Skywalker and that Inferno Jedi Master, decided to paint it in his team's colors, just as a way to show who he was. The racer Skywalker built was the fastest ever seen, and now Anakin was hopeful that he would win again. When the race started, there was no sabotage from Saboba, just a hungry racer ready to prove that he could win this without extra assistance. Truthfully, he proved himself in this return to the Boonta Eve Raceway. The 3-lap race kicked off to an exciting beginning. Saboba and Anakin were neck and neck. Due to the size of Saboba's new racer, he couldn't bully other members of the track lineup. Instead, he had to hope that his piloting skills and his abilities were better than Anakin's. Early in, it was clear that Anakin's old racer was faster than the newer one, but he used the lessons passed on by Qui Gon. The issue is, just thinking about the Jedi Master threw him off his game. So he was battling one of the most talented racers in the game, with the fastest pod ever invented, and then his inner demons on top of that. This proved to be catastrophic for his race effort, especially after they left the cave systems. There was a small canyon before the rock obstacle course where the Tusken Raiders like to hang out. When the racers showed up the first time, the leaders of the pack escaped unscathed. The second time around though, the Raiders were ready and they fired down on the track. The Hutts loved this. It made them more profit and it also kept the game as interesting as it could be. The young pilot maneuvered around their shots until he was clipped in the shoulder, which sent a shock of pain through his body. Anakin's shoulder was covered in ripped cloth and blood, but he stayed the course, forcing his throttle in and moving across the Boonta Eve Raceway. Despite the Tuskens interfering, Anakin was able to maintain course. It was very challenging for him, but he trusted his instincts. Due to only being 10 years old, almost 11, the fact that his entire right arm was dysfunctional should have been the end of not just the race, but his life. Instead, the young local boy sped after Saboba, keeping close behind him in all the corners. The pain in his dominant arm eventually got the best of him. As he tried to keep pace with Saboba, he lost to the experienced racer. The real killer was the straightaway. Anakin, after the first lap, understood that this straightaway would be what decided the race for him, and he needed to be at the top of his game before entering it. The second lap was again dominated by Anakin and Saboba, but when the third lap came around, Anakin could barely even finish. He was able to fend off potential passers, but it was very difficult. When Anakin pulled to a stop in second place, the medics came out to patch him up as Saboba revved his engine for the crowd. Shmi, Kitster, and Wald were the first people to Anakin's side. He may have not won, but he still did fantastic, and he would win some credits for his placement. Not as much as Saboba, but enough where he could upgrade his racer some. Skywalker was so frustrated, and he ranted at his mom as the medic cleaned up his arm and put some bandages on it. Shmi listened but told him that it wasn't the end of the world. He could continue racing, and the next time he could beat Saboba. Anakin was so frustrated, but she made a great point. While his new racer was pretty optimal, it wasn't as fast as the previous one he built. The downside of coming short on Boonta Eve was how many sponsors he'd lose. After winning, his name was on the map. After this, not so much. Most of these sponsors didn't care what happened during a race. If their racer was damaged or the individual piloting the vehicle suffered some sort of issue during the race, it didn't matter to them. They only cared about winners and losers. So despite a 10-year-old boy racing his heart out, getting shot by a Tusken Raider and still finishing in second, they couldn't care less. Shmi still celebrated Anakin's win by having Walt and Kitster over for dinner and letting them have a sleepover. It was hard to move past the race for Anakin, especially with the constant reminder stabbing him in the arm. He persevered though. He saw what his mother meant and he followed her words of guidance. Anakin continued working on his vehicle and trying to figure out a way to make it go faster. All the while, he and Shmi kept adding to the funds needed to free her from slavery. Anakin's 11th birthday followed not long after the loss at Boonta Eve, and this year felt like the worst of his life. Shmi was almost killed in a quarrel between Watto and another slave owner. His best friend Wald was walking down the street when a gang ran a heist and he was flattened and killed by a speeder. Kitster was alright, but Anakin was devastated by the almost loss of his mother and the death of one of his best friends. Anakin tried to get into a qualifier, which he did, and before the race, a local Natalan racer sabotaged his racer. His name was Tazu or something, and he was frequently jealous of Anakin. So in an attempt to make himself feel vindicated, he almost killed Skywalker by flipping some energetic binders inside of his engine when Anakin wasn't at his racer. So when Skywalker turned the pod racer on, one of the engines detached and sped into the air before slamming down and detonating. Anakin was shocked, but he was very glad that the outcome was this. While he couldn't ever trace it back to Tazu, the encounter made him grateful that the entire engine didn't just combust, because it could have swallowed him whole. Following the explosion that destroyed part of his racer, he considered the possibility that he made a mistake. He loved his mom and he would never regret staying here with her, but almost 2 years of life, plus the countless other years before that, had been wasted getting nowhere with this thing. Shmi was the one who convinced him that maybe he was just seeing it from the wrong perspective. There were simply other ways of looking at things. Anakin was thinking about getting a normal mechanic's job, or working inside of a warehouse just for the sake of earning some credits to help put towards her freedom. But Shmi believed that Anakin would find the right path for himself, not something so mundane. Due to how hard Anakin was on himself, Kitster found it difficult to be around him. It was always focused on this, that, or the other, and never really focused on the present. The truth is, Anakin was always focused on the present, but he couldn't escape his fear of slipping into obscurity, of becoming nothing greater than what he was now. What a terrifying thought. One life in this galaxy, one with planets of trees, water, fire, life, and nature, and yet he could be wasting it. Kitster was a necessary loss at the end of the day. Anakin didn't want to see it that way, and Shmi was almost the one to encourage Anakin to make amends with the kid, but Anakin didn't want to, and that was his position. There was nothing wrong with it. Kitster just couldn't see why he was so dedicated to this path. Without another race on Tatooine until the next Boonta Eve, Anakin was kinda stuck, but luckily there was someone who had scouts following Skywalker around. Due to the big money in the pod racing game, which was considerably big in the Outer Rim, this particular sponsor paid for people to move into Anakin's neighborhood and watch him. Yeah, sounds a little odd. It was. No way around that. It looked odd. But the sponsor was doing this simply because he wanted to make credits off of young Skywalker. It wasn't until Anakin dropped his friend a few months after his previous loss and spent more time working on his pod racer that the sponsor sent his goons in to get Anakin. These guys were paid off grunts and they approached him, asking if they could speak with him. Due to the sponsor and the goons not being from Tatooine, they didn't understand that this approach was a threat on Tatooine, so Anakin whipped out a pipe and bashed one of them in the head before telling them to stay back. The other goon held out his hand and showed a fob, telling him that he had a sponsor. Anakin wasn't eased by this, but a hologram popped up and an Ishi-Tib man spoke. He wore nice garments and he looked like he was pampered by life in the core, which was far from the truth. He referred to Anakin as young Skywalker and asked if he'd have any interest in competing in the Malair Open. Anakin nodded his head and told the sponsor that he didn't have the credits to do so. The man told Anakin that he'd pay for his transportation and everything, but he needed to win that race. Skywalker said that he could do it. One of the goons got upset, but the Ishi-Tib man silenced him, telling him that it was good for a kid to stand up for himself. What a pity of a man he should be. The sponsor introduced himself as Wark Sil, and told Anakin that he'd be there in the morning to pick him up and his pod racer. Anakin ran to Shmi afterwards, who fully embraced this idea, telling him that she would support him if he wanted to do this. They celebrated this potential acceleration into stardom, and Shmi grabbed Anakin by the shoulders, telling him to not let this moment feel too big. This was his. He was always destined to be a star. He could do it. No matter how much competition was out there, he could beat them all. When the morning came around, Wark walked up to Anakin and Shmi's home, knocking on the door. Anakin was excited when he saw the sponsor. The Ishi-Tib man was calm with his voice. It was soft and trusting. It reminded Anakin of Qui Gon. When Anakin met Qui Gon and they got along, He thought that the Jedi would be like his father figure. Now that it had been almost 2 full years since they last saw the Jedi Master, he hadn't had a new fatherly figure. Anakin, in a way, hoped that the sponsor could become that, but in his heart, he knew that it wouldn't happen. As a sponsor, Wark was only in this for the money, so he didn't have any reason to actually care about Anakin aside from the fact that he should win. The initiative man gently placed his hand on Anakin's shoulder and asked if that was his new racer. Anakin nodded his head. There was a new engine compartment on it. Thanks to Tazu, Anakin needed to replace the engine, but it looked really good. Its dimensions were a little longer, but it looked like it weighed a bit lighter. Wark tapped the button on his wrist as he turned back to see Shmi. He asked if this was Anakin's mother, and he nodded his head. He quickly moved over and introduced himself, inviting her to come along with them to Malastair. She was a bit nervous, but Wark was very clear that this would be all expenses paid. He understood that Anakin lost the previous race, but he saw that Anakin lost the race because he was injured. The fact that he powered through the injury proved to him that he was worthwhile. Skywalker was a tough kid. As a sponsor, he was there when his racer exploded, so while Anakin was getting frustrated, he could see that Tazu was cheering away from it as it was. This told Wark that Anakin was sabotaged by the other racer, one who didn't even win that qualifier to begin with. Regardless, they went through with their strategy for this race. There'd be a run-through and then they would actually do the race. Due to the sponsor having such influence over the game, he was able to get Anakin into the starting lineup, which also meant that he'd be racing against Saboba again. The Galactic Champion was ready to win at his home course. Anakin and Shmi were treated to the upper-class lifestyle, and it proved to Anakin what his life could become. If he raced well, this could be his life. Fine delicacies, drinks, warm water, air conditioning, views, comfortable clothing, and remarkable furniture. They had a week to strategize and enjoy these delicacies. Wark was empathetic about the fact that he wanted Shmi to be freed, and to set them up with a good life. However, they needed to win this race. He expressed that he could put the odds really low for Anakin, making the payout even higher. So say with 1 to 17 odds, they could make 17 credits for every 1 credit spent. He was going to try and make those odds worse, so that when Anakin did win, they'd have enough money to spend wherever they wanted. Wark was in this business for a long while. He made his credits from Canto Bight, and his advisor, who was also a Malastair, was going to play on the other side of the equation. Wark's advisor was giving everything to make Anakin unworthy of a good bat. In the meantime, Wark would be hyping Anakin up, so that he could get bets against him and or for him. It'd be a good way to cash in himself. He also started a small fund for Anakin, to make sure he could earn some credits for himself when this was over. What Anakin and Shmi didn't know is that while Wark was successful, a lot of his racers died, but that wasn't related to him. He had millions of credits off of dead racers. He was hopeful to have Anakin with them for a lot longer than the previous racers he had. Wark would have told them of these deaths, but they weren't related to him in the slightest, so why would he? On the night before the race, they gave out rankings and betting odds. On Malastair, the event was a much more formal one. Unlike the Boonta Eve, it allowed for bettors to get involved, and it gave gambling rings and casinos around the galaxy time to boost their numbers and place their bets. It was a very good event for gamblers. Anakin's starting position was 11th in the pack of 18, with a 1 to 23 odd of winning. While it didn't look great, Wark told Anakin that this is exactly what they wanted. The following day, they were in the garage. Despite living the upper-class life for the last several days, Anakin was still working on his racer. He could borrow parts from some of the other crews. While there were familiar faces here on Malastair, the facilities were much better kept, and despite there being familiar faces, they were much kinder here than on Tatooine. The racers were willing to let Anakin use their spare parts and tools that he never even heard of. Even a couple people helped him out with them. Malastair was much stricter with their racers being kind and not cheating than Tatooine was. It was the whole keeping up a public image thing. There weren't Tusken Raiders or firing squads, and the race was pretty clean. Anakin was a little nervous as 3PO walked with Anakin's racer flag out in front of the starting line. Anakin shook his shoulders, loosening himself up. He turned to the right and he could see his mother and Wark behind some glass in one of the various sponsor suites. Over to Anakin's right there was an obelisk that shot into the sky. On it were the racers and their betting odds, as well as each of their positions. The Malastair Raceway was much larger than the Boonta Eve. The race was much more grueling too. It required the racers to go for 10 laps. Anakin got into his racer and turned the engine on. He didn't even pay attention to any outside noise. Shmi could see how locked in he was, and Wark stood at the front of the glass. Inside their suite were other bidders and high spenders. Within moments, the race started and Skywalker sped off, following behind the pack leaders. In a pack of 18, he was in a tight position. He was pulling a speeder from side to side, trying to fit in where he could, but there was very little movement. The first straightaway on the course was tight, forcing the racers to speed forward, but also squeeze down to a 2x2 formation. The most difficult part of this was to trust the racers around them. If Saboba had his larger racer, he would have been pushing and shoving, but now he wasn't. Some of the other larger racers didn't do that. They understood that a crash here could ruin the race for them. Anakin patiently sat between racers before speeding out into the next part of the race, which was an obstacle course of sorts. During the walkthrough, or run-through, Anakin found the best spots for himself. The issue is, at high speeds, it was much more difficult to navigate. He whipped his racer back and forth before pulling through and speeding past 9th and 10th place. Next came the circuit, which was a nightmare. This part of the track had ramps that led people into the air or underground, forcing again the racers to pick their paths. Anakin quickly navigated through this, and then he saw Saboba ahead of him. But that formerly yellow pod racer, now orange, sped to the front of the pack without any real competition around it. Anakin could see his rival escaping him, and he shoved his throttle forward, spinning over another racer before boosting out of the obstacle course. Anakin trailed behind places 1 through 7, as he sped to catch up to the rest of them. There were more tightrope places across the map as they balanced on the edge of a cliff, or used a natural bridge to cross a canyon. Anakin had a hard time keeping up. Truthfully, ever since his win in the Boonta Eve 2 years before, racers have been modifying their racers to be smaller and faster. There were of course the big engine vessels, but more racers used smaller size to their advantage. What made things difficult for Anakin was the fact that he was competing against experienced racers. So not only was his vessel comparable to their speeds, but they had more time racing than he did years lived. Skywalker spent the duration of laps 1 through 5, catching up to 3rd position. As he got more acquainted with the map, it got easier for him to maneuver in it, but he was still stuck behind the 2 best racers in the pack. What became even more challenging as they rounded the 7th lap into the 8th was they started facing the last place racers. Aside from those who were destroyed during the race, there were still racers who were behind the rest of the pack. Saboba jolted forward, whipping past the last place racer and overlapping him, as 2nd place and Anakin did the same. Anakin slipped between 1 and 2 as they battled for control over the race, and with Anakin now in the lead, they now had a common enemy. Anakin pulled away as Saboba and number 3 kept up behind him. He dodged as they moved through 2 obstacle courses and across the canyon flats, and then the tightrope. Saboba and the 3rd place racer competed for a spot on the tightrope as the Malastarian racer smashed his racer into 3rd place and knocked him off the course and threw him down into the canyon into a fiery blaze. Anakin had 2 more laps to keep this up, and if he did, he was a winner. Saboba and Skywalker, the longtime rivals from the Boonta Eve, pushed each other to be their best. In a weird way, this competition made them neck-and-neck racers. Skywalker, in the inferior model of the vessel he first created, pushed back against Saboba. As they came into the final lap of the race, Skywalker could feel the engine giving out on him. The most grueling part of the Malair Raceway was the fact that it was so long. Pod racers weren't designed for long-distance runs, and there were no pit stops allowed, which is why some of the racers tried a slow and steady tactic, which did work sometimes. But both Saboba and Anakin were pushing their vehicles for what could very well be a galactic record. Saboba sped up to the side of Anakin and looked over, taunting him by waving his hand. They approached the tightrope, and with Saboba's superior speed, he launched in front of Anakin, taking away his advantage of the tightrope. Due to Anakin having the lead for the last 2 rounds, this would be the place where Saboba could actually steal the victory out from Anakin. Thanks to the canyon below them, Saboba couldn't force Anakin to go faster when he was in the lead, because if he did, it could likely kill them both. Anakin pulled behind Saboba as he sped forward, whipping his racer between corners and across the natural bridge. Anakin followed behind, but he could feel his racer giving out on him. He started to panic. Saboba was running his racer around one final corner of the race, before the twisted downhill. Unlike the Boonta Eve, there wasn't a straightaway to the finale. It was a twisted course that came down from the plateau the racers had to climb up. It was a downhill because, at lap 10, most racers were giving up and they would naturally drift down to the finish and allow for a photo finish. Anakin closed the flaps on his energetic thrusters and revved his engine, blowing smoke out the back. It was equatable to a downshift as he drifted around the corner catching a slipstream off Saboba, while also saving himself some energy. Before he reopened the flaps and ignited the thrusters to their max speed, Anakin closed his eyes for a moment. He could feel it all coming at him. They were moving at what felt like light speed, and he launched himself down the turns. The downhill twist was designed for no engines, and that's what Saboba was preparing for. He was going to keep his engine on mid-power and throw himself into victory. In the final corner, he didn't even see Skywalker to begin with, but Anakin boosted forward, cutting in between corners as he caught up to Saboba, who caught sight of Skywalker with his peripherals and boosted his engine forward. Skywalker's pod racer may have not been designed for speed like the other one, but this one was designed for cornering, which gave him the advantage in the scenario. Anakin tried to weave around the Malastarian racer, as he made his very small racer feel as large as possible, but Anakin at the last corner saw his opportunity. It was now or never. Skywalker sped forward and flipped his racer as he looked down at Saboba, as he floated effortlessly overhead. Anakin saw his opportunity and shoved in the throttle all the way in as he sped forward and smashed down to the ground. Anakin could feel it. Saboba tried to catch up, but Anakin couldn't stop it now. It was victory. He pulled through as the crowd jumped up in unison as celebration commenced. Anakin did it. Not only was this a record-breaking race for both Saboba and Anakin, but he had the photo finish too. Images of Anakin's racer completely upside down over Saboba quickly made their rounds in galactic circles as the kids started trending on the HoloNet. This was a victory finish unlike any other in pod racing history, and people wanted to know what just happened. As Anakin finished, Wark and Shmi were quickly by his side, hoisting him up and celebrating his victory. He did it. After a dry comeback, he was able to find his victory, and even better, he did it at his longtime rival's home track. There wasn't any more of an embarrassing loss that Saboba could have had. The following several hours were filled with interviews, payouts, and Wark managing everything for Anakin, so he didn't have to worry about a thing. Now, if Wark was a bad man, which he could be considered one, he could take his credits and run off. But where was the fun in that? Anakin and Shmi would make 45% on Anakin's race this time around, and because of the odds that were against Skywalker, they made a lot of money. Now, there was no contract for him to oblige by, but he was a decent person, so he obliged by his own contract. Wark saw this as a long-term investment, so while he could run away with 100% and make off like a bandit, why do that when he could certify Anakin Skywalker as a record breaker of the Malaster Raceway? He could make credits upon credits for doing this. Anakin's victory would signify the beginning of a great change in his life, one that would take him on the journey of a lifetime. It involved him buying property on Canto Bight, seeing the stars as he always dreamed about, finding himself with more credits than he'd ever seen, and getting himself sponsorships and everything in between. Before Anakin was a pod racer, it was regarded as an underground sport. But with him becoming a staple, the HoloNet started to drum up support for the support in the core. With the core money getting involved in the game following Anakin's race, it became a staple in the galactic economy. Aside from, of course, the new money flowing into the sport, the racers became superstars. They were wanted for interviews on the biggest stages of the galaxy. Places like Coruscant were starting to open up their own raceways so they could bring Coruscants to their systems. As the support continued to expand, Anakin continued gaining wealth. The limelight was very kind to him, and his life became one of attention. With this newfound attention, when Anakin reached young adulthood, he was living the life. Shmi was living in the residence next to his in Canto Bight, and he was having parties almost every night. He was almost like a tourist attraction, and he loved every moment of it. People across the galaxy came to Canto Bight to party with Anakin Skywalker, renowned pod racing legend. There wasn't really any athlete in the galaxy that could compare to him. He was on the front of magazines, billboards, ad campaigns, and even colognes. His favorite was his personal Skywalker cologne. It was a place that he was untouchable, and while there was a certain level of ego behind the man that he became, if it weren't for his mother, he may have gone off the charts with that ego. The partying was a bit excessive, but he was having fun, and that's all that mattered to Shmi. Anakin earned all of this by being a phenomenal racer, and she couldn't be happier for him. During his travels, he did come into contact with Qui Gon Jinn again. Turned out he survived his special mission. He got back to his ship and they engaged with Maul in the desert. Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon survived, but they cut off half of Maul's blade. Without Anakin having to be around, they could afford to fight the Sith apprentice until he ran. They were able to prove the existence of the dark side user with the blade. It encouraged the Jedi to send a council member on the off chance that the dark side user was indeed a Sith. Qui-Gon had seen Anakin over the years on the HoloNet and on billboards, and he wanted to approach him, but decided not to. They accidentally ran into each other, and Skywalker told Qui-Gon that his decision to remain on Tatooine was the greatest he ever made. Because in the years since Qui-Gon left, the Jedi never came back. But you know who did? Anakin did. After he made his millions, he started to quote-unquote buy slaves. He bought them up and sent them to other locations so that they could be free people. Anakin had a starter package. He used it as a way to bring awareness to the neglect in the Outer Rim. It made Palpatine look bad in politics, but the Chancellor didn't really care about racers, believing that the Skywalker boy would just kill himself in a pod race as it was, so why did it matter? Biggest issue was handling the situation that resulted from pod racer becoming so big. There were calls for the freedom of the slaves, and while Dooku left the Jedi Order, he never became the leader of a resistance, so Sidious had to use someone else. That person became responsible for the beginning of the Clone Wars. While Palpatine was searching for Dooku, his former apprentice, in shame, retreated into a Barash vow. He told the Jedi about Palpatine, but he didn't want to. They didn't deserve to be saved. Dooku never killed Yaddle, but he simply just vanished, and he learned to forgive himself for killing his lifelong best friend, Sifo Dyas. Dooku hoped that when he returned to the galaxy he could save Qui Gon from the war that was to come, but time would tell. The war that followed never really bothered Anakin. Was it sad? Sure, but he was a racer. His biggest cares in the galaxy were racing and his foundation. Despite having businesses that gave him millions and even billions of credits, he spent a lot of his money on the slaves of the Outer Rim, freeing them and bringing them to new locations and setting them up. Wark and Anakin continued to maintain a strong relationship over the years, and it was the initiative sponsor that Anakin viewed as a father figure. He knew that Wark was only interested in Anakin for the money, but it was because of Wark that he was able to have his free life. Of course, by this point, their relationship was less about money and more about each other, but it didn't hurt that dynamic, knowing how it started at least. With the Clone Wars raging on around them, Anakin kept his comfort on Canto Bight. Sadly, the war was bad for the racing business, and they had to stop all the races altogether. But Anakin and a couple of the racers he became friends with over the years decided to do a charity race in the middle of the third year of the war. Their charity race was for fun, and it had the most viewers for any sport in galactic history. People chimed in and paid into the charitable race. It was a relief effort race, one that was meant to assist the people of the galaxy, and it did just that. They raised nearly 1 trillion credits, and it went out to the people that needed it most in the galaxy. Anakin and Shmi remained comfortable on Canto Bight, as Skywalker found himself a young prodigy. It was a kid like him, born into slavery on Canto Bight. Skywalker, when he moved to the planet, freed all the slaves and forced the shopkeepers and Fathier Housers to take care of their workers, even giving them a minimum age requirement. Anakin's work for the people really was generational on the planet he now called home, and so one of these kids took up an interest in pod racing, showing off their abilities early on into his life. So while the galaxy delved into chaos, Anakin taught this kid everything he knew. While Anakin's biggest supporter was his mother, he never really had a draw to any other emotional connections aside from Wark and this up-and-coming potential superstar. The Clone Wars came to an end with the execution of Order 66, and the death of Palpatine at the hands of former Jedi Dooku and Master Windu. Due to the fact that Dooku never traveled down the dark path, he stayed strong and healthy, even gaining a sense of youth from his connection to the Force during his Barash vow. None of this mattered to Anakin. The only two good things the Jedi did during the Clone Wars, or even in the last 20 years, were take down the Zygerian Empire and die. Order 66 wiped them off the map. With the destruction came the end of the Clone Wars, which Anakin couldn't be more excited for. As the galaxy moved back into a state of semi-democracy, Anakin and his friends in the racing game returned to their races. They were a little rusty, even after the charity race, but they did. Pod racing got even more popularity after the war, because it was hope for normalcy. During the war, there were no sports, no entertainment. People weren't able to feel the freedom of the years before the war. When pod racing became a common thing again, people got excited. Skywalker collaborated with other racers to begin a minor league, so that up-and-coming racers could get their chance in the spotlight, maybe even qualify for the major league. The big thing with pod racing before Anakin's popularity was the fact that there was no organization. Following the boost of people watching, it needed more organization, and it ironically stole power from the Hutts in the Outer Rim. The Boonta Eve was huge for business, and if they didn't conform to League regulations, they would lose their track. Jabba didn't want to, but they had to. There was actual money in this, and if the New Republic ever came after the criminal empire, which they would, they could still have a means to make money. Due to the creation of the minor league, the kid Anakin mentored had a chance to get into the racing game from a young age. Skywalker kept his racing game alive for another 8 years until his student became a full-time racer. Anakin's reputation was that of the father of pod racing, and even more than that, the greatest racer to ever grace the pod racer. The record at the end of his time was 201 wins, 14 losses, and 1 tie, with the only tie coming at the end of Saboba's career. His last race was a victory, one that had tears and cheers. Watching the greatest to ever do it step off the stage was a moment the entire galaxy was present for, getting even more viewership than the charity match. But most importantly for Anakin, Shmi and his newest partner were the ones there, as well as Wark. The only other racer he ever lost to was Saboba. It was a lifetime rivalry, and despite their initial distaste for each other, it was in their later years that they became best friends. At the time of Anakin's retirement, which came 6 years after Saboba stopped racing, he had himself a partner. Maya Val was the newest addition to his life, and perhaps his favorite newest person to be a part of his journey. They remained on Canto Bight because they both adored the city lights, but also how small everything felt. The planet didn't allow for overpopulation, so it was always comfortable. And there was, of course, especially due to Anakin, a waitlist for tourists to get onto the planet. A separate city was built because of this, one that mirrored the main city, so they could allow more people onto the planet at a time and make more money. Wark was able to continue his sponsoring with Anakin's replacement, the young kid from Canto Bight, but he always maintained a strong relationship with the boy-turned-man who saw him like a father. Skywalker and Maya started a happy life with each other, as Anakin and Shmi kept themselves in a very close bond. For Anakin, this was a result of being a pro-racer, and choosing himself and his mother over the Jedi way. But more than anything, if it wasn't for his mother's constant belief in him, and her pushing him to be the best version of himself, he never would have found the happiness he did in the life he had now, for himself and his found family. And that, my friends, is our story.